Good afternoon. I'll be continuing the report about globalization and its ethical issues. I'll be discussing about effects of globalization. The effects of globalization can be felt locally and globally, touching the lives of individuals as well as the broader society in following ways. Una ay individuals. Here, a variety of international influences affect ordinary people. And by ordinary people, meaning individuals and individuals, meaning us. So we are influenced by international people or influencers yung sinasabi nga nila. Example of those are YouTubers, TikTokers, and other people from social media that we can see from other countries. Globalization affects their access to goods, the prices they pay, and their ability to travel to or even move to other countries. In addition, globalization does not only affect us externally with our access to goods, the prices we pay, and our ability to travel to other countries, but as well as our mindsets and standards. Unang-una na nababago ng globalization ang ating mga kaisipan sa mga bagay na hindi pangkaraniwan or hindi local na nandito sa atin na ating kinasanayan. On the next slide, I'll be explaining about it further. Individual effects of globalization. Standard of living is the level of wealth, comfort, material goods, and necessities available to a certain socioeconomic class in a certain geographic area. Halimbawa, sa US, the standard of living is having a house, a car, 4 seasonal clothes, and improved basic necessities, but costs more compared dito sa Pilipinas. Our standard of living is just having a house, clothes, and other simple basic necessities that sometimes do not meet its end or hindi natutugunan. Sometimes we desire to experience it this well. Aminin man natin sa hindi, we are also guilty of sometimes thinking na sana sa US na lang ako nakatira, sana sa US na lang ako nabuhay dahil ang standard of living nila ay mas higit kaysa dito sa Pilipinas. For in fact, we desire things that finds us comfort, pleasure, and satisfaction, but mostly it is not present in ourselves. But to be able to experience the quality of life is much more expensive than living our lives today. To be able to experience that kind of standard of living is much more expensive or much more further than our quality of lifestyle right now. So, yun. We'll be discussing about quality of life. So, quality of life is the degree to which a person enjoys the important possibilities of his or her life. So, quality of life ay parang standard of living, ngunit iba-iba sa tao, parang class, social class. Merong lower class, merong upper class, and merong middle class. Yun. For many developing nations, globalization has led to an improvement in standard of living through improved roads and transportation, improved healthcare, and improved education due to the global expansion of corporation. Ito ay dulot ng mga investors na mga foreigners na pumupunta dito sa Pilipinas or sa ating bansa para magbahagi ng kanilang experiences doon or parang to colonize us once again. Or parang ganun. However, globalization has had a negative effect on individuals who live in developed nations. This is due to the fact that corporations now have an option of establishing manufacturing operations in nations where manufacturing and production costs are less expensive. As a result, many manufacturing jobs leave developed nations and move to developing nations. So, yung mga kumpanya sa developed nations ay may choice to leave their country and move to other nation where the cost of living is low. For example, ang Pilipinas, the cost of living is low compared sa US. So, yun. The next is the effects of globalization in communities. This level encompasses the impact of globalization on local or regional organizations, businesses, and economies. So yun. to find jobs that is suitable to provide for one's need. Sometimes ay wala dito sa ating lugar kaya humahanap tayo sa ibang bansa or sa ibang lugar. Yun. It affects who lives in communities where they work, who they work for, the ability to move out of their community and into one in another country, among other things. So, primarily example scenario, halimbawa ay ang ating parents or kung sino man sa ating ang may magulang na nagtatrabaho overseas or OFW, ay yun ang ating example scenario right now. So, example scenario ay may magulang na numanais ng magtrabaho sa ibang bansa dahil nalaman niya na mas mahal or parang mas mahal yung sahod ng nurses sa ibang bansa. They work overseas thinking that jobs from economically stable countries provide high wages or may mataas na sweldo. At totoo naman iyon. Halimbawa, sa euros, ito ay 55 times greater than Philippine peso. So back to our example scenario ay tayo yung magulang and may papaisip natin nang nalaman natin na yung annual paying job pala ng nurses sa San Francisco ay nagkakahalaga ng $149,746 annually for an average nurses lamang. At may isip natin, nga pala makakatulong yun sa ating pamilya. Nga pala makakatulong yun para umunlad ang buhay din at sumaga ng buhay ng aking mga anak. Yun ang unang may isip ng ating mga magulang. That's why they choose to leave our country para magtrabaho sa ibang bansa. Sometimes, yan ang mga primary reasons dahil yan sa globalization. And globalization also changes the way local cultures develop within communities. Yan. Hindi lamang sa ganung bagay nakaka-apekto yung globalization, but as well as changing our culture or shaping our culture to be like this. For example, minsan, di ba may isang scenario na napapakasyon sa atin sa school, sinasabi na yung culture ay ang susi para umunlad ang isang ekonomiya ng bansa. Where in fact, maybe it is partially true sa ibang bansa or sa ibang scenario sa ibang bansa, pero in reality, globalization has a huge impact sa pagpapalago ng ating bansa economically speaking. Lalong-lalo na kung ang ating bansa ay parang mababa ang forex rates or parang mababa yung halaga ng pera kumpara sa ibang bansa. Iyon yung isang huge factor na nakakaapekto sa ikauunlad ng ating bansa. So, globalization affects our community. And the next is globalization affects institutions. Multinational corporations, national governments, and other organizations such as colleges and universities are all affected by their country's approach to and acceptable globalization. So the basic example of globalization towards institutions is yung sinasabi natin na mandatory K-12 or the additional 2 years in secondary education towards the Filipino students. So, it is set by our local government para mapunuan ang kukulangang edukasyon to be like the standard of other developed countries like in the US na sila ay may K-12 na sila before pa at nahati sa kanila yung parang educational system nila na elementary yun ay ang kinder hanggang grade 5. And middle school yun ay ang grade 6 hanggang grade 8 at high school naman ay ang grade 9 hanggang grade 12. Yun. Parang yun yung system na parang inadapt natin dito sa Pilipinas. Example of globalization towards institution. And to continue, globalization affects the ability of companies to grow and expand a university's ability to diversify and grow its student body and a government's ability to pursue specific economic policies. So, hindi lamang sa eskwela or hindi lamang sa universities or educational speaking naka-apply ang globalization towards institution, but as well as sa mga mambabatas or parang economic policies para mapaunlad. Parang there's a huge factor that dahil sa globalization ay pwede umunlad or bumagsak ang isang bansa or isang institution or isang kumpanya. by globalization ay parang we compare things around the world kung how their system works, or is it possible ba to apply this in our country para rin maranasan natin ang kaunlaran or kasaganahan. So that is globalization towards institute. And as well as, sabi dito, globalization affects, ayan nga, economic policies, and as well as to adapt in certain changes and innovations. So hindi lamang sa ability to grow, but to adapt certain changes and innovations. So in short, globalization in institution is the openness for change and resolution that sometimes would take about burying or diversifying one's culture. So meaning, minsan ay parang i-disregard muna natin yung ating culture just because we want to improve or we want to economically rise or parang to be like other countries. Sometimes ay i-disregard muna yan. Parang accepting diversity or diverse situations na galing sa iba't ibang bansa. Yun. While the effects of globalization can be observed or nakikita natin or madaling masabi na that we have globalization, though analyzing the net impact is more complex. Kung i-analyze natin ay ibang usapan yun. It is more complex and it is therefore complicated. Proponents often see specific results as positive, and critics of globalization view the same results as negative. A relationship that benefits one entity may damage another, and whether globalization benefits the world at large remains a point of contention. So, there are proponents and critics of globalization that na masasabi ay mayroong huge impact or may magandang positive impact, and the critics would say negative impact. So, to be able to avoid having to stand for each of those, ay kailangan natin ng holism or holistic view to be able to view as proponents and critics of globalization. Para hindi tayo umabot sa extent where magsisisi tayo dahil we lost our culture, or hindi tayo abot din sa point na ay kulang tayo so we need more of it. So dapat we are in the equilibrium or we are in the balance of viewing globalization to be able to view it as improvisation sa ating bansa. To be able to view it as both positive and negative at walang bias. So, but the key of it is having contention either way. So, that is for the effects of globalization. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Ivy Fuga, and our topic is about the ethical issues in globalization. So we have 5 main issues. First is jobs, brain drain, natural resources, health, and lastly financial. So the first on the ethical issues is jobs. One of the main issues concerning the globalization of the planet is that it has put many jobs in first world countries in jeopardy. So in terms of the world system, they are ranked from first world to third world. The first world refers to the countries that are more developed and industrialized societies. However, the third world countries are those that have high poverty rates, economic instability, and lack basic human needs. So, globalization created so many jobs at risk in the first world countries. Mind workers such as engineers, lawyers, and doctors generally have the ability to find jobs and demand high prices for their works in first world countries. However, laborers and manual workers are experiencing loss of jobs in the first world countries, considering that their services can be obtained much more cheaply in the third world countries. Second is the brain drain. The brain drain effect of globalization is another ethical issue. It refers to talented and educated people in the third world countries who leave their countries of origin for better opportunities in first world countries. This leaves third world countries lacking homegrown, educated professionals such as doctors and engineers. So basically, globalization helps people to understand what different parts of the world has to offer. It facilitates brain drain in the sense that people move to and settle where they think they're suitable in. But another factor is the lack of facilities suitable to the individual in the origin country. So third world countries loses its most educated and talented workers to other countries through migration. And this has negative effects including loss of tax revenues by the home country and loss of key health and education service professionals. Third is the natural resources. According to the State of the World 2006 report, the world's ecological capacity is simply insufficient to satisfy the ambition of China, India, Japan, Europe, and the United States, as well as the aspiration of the rest of the world in a sustainable way. So State of the World 2006 provides a special focus on China and India and their impact on the world as major consumers of resources and polluters of local and global ecosystem. So rainforests around the world are being cut down for fuel, and this will have a huge effect on the oxygen levels for the entire planet. So if rainforests disappears, the air quality will drop and we will start inhaling more carbon dioxide. Fourth is health. Easier means of transportation can easily lead to the spread of highly infectious disease. This is, however, no modern phenomena. In the 14th century, the Black Death spread from Asia to Europe, wiping out approximately 50% of Europe's population. So globalization has had a large effect on international travel, with serious consequences for global health. The liberalization of the airline industry in many countries has made air travel more affordable for more and more people around the world, which has led to a dramatic increase in the amount of global air travel. So basically, it is entirely possible for a person in the early stages of an infectious disease could be halfway around the world 12 to 15 hours and thus function as a vector for that disease, aiding its spread perhaps into vulnerable non-immune populations. Lastly is financial. Due to an increasingly globalized world, there is a growing market and financial interdependency between nations. The United States subprime mortgage crisis was a multinational financial crisis that occurred between 2007 and 2010 that contributed to the 2007 global financial crisis. It was triggered by a large decline in U.S. home prices after the collapse of a housing bubble, leading to mortgage delinquencies, foreclosures, and the devaluation of housing-related securities. The crisis had severe, long-lasting consequences for the U.S. and the European economies. The U.S. entered a deep recession with nearly 9 million jobs lost during 2008 and 2009. Europe also continued to struggle with its own economic crisis. So those are the 5 main ethical issues on globalization. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Our next discussion is about the moral dilemmas of globalization. So, even in globalization, moral dilemma happens. From our previous discussions, we already tackled about moral dilemma. Kapag po sinabi nating moral dilemma, it is an irresolvable moral conflict. That is, no fully satisfactory resolution is possible since all possible options for actions leave behind a remainder that does not cease to be morally binding. What are these moral dilemmas of globalization? First is labor standards. Child labor is an especially critical issue in such debates. Child labor refers to the exploitation of children through any form of work that deprives children of their childhood, interferes with their ability to attend regular school, and is mentally, physically, socially, and morally harmful. In Western multinational, managers would not even think about hiring children in their home country since it would be both illegal and offensive to the moral sense of the community. However, in some emerging economies, child labor is common and even essential for the subsistence of the child. So, there are countries na mahigpit sa kanilang labor standards at hindi nila inaalaw yung child labor. But in other countries, child labor is very dominant, especially to non-wealthy countries. The common reason din kung bakit nagkakaroon ng child labor is that it is the subsistence of the child. Kapag po sinabi nating subsistence, ibig sabihin, ito yung primary source or means to obtain the necessities for life. Dahil nga mahirap ang pamumuhay, nakikipagsapalaran yung mga bata na makapagtrabaho para may makain at makapagsuporta sa kanilang pamilya. And in this matter, does this make hiring children morally acceptable? This is an ethical question that is raised in the labor standards of globalization. Another dilemma of labor standards is the differences in workers' safety standards. The SS United States was one of the most luxurious cruise ships of the 1950s. In the 1990s, the company decided to have it refurbished, which required removing asbestos from the vessel. Refurbished po meaning renovation or repairing. And the asbestos is a mineral that is being used on ships due to its fire-resistant feature. But this mineral is very lethal and dangerous once inhaled. So, conducting the task under U.S. strict worker safety norms had a cost of $100 million. The company then decided to outsource the job in Turkey, where the cost was only $2 million. Since finally the Turkish authorities would not allow it for fear that workers would get cancer, the ship was towed to the Russian port of Sevastopol, where asbestos were removed for even less, thanks to even lower standards in worker safety. In this situation, the moral dilemma here is the differences in worker safety standards. How companies should assess the safety of their workers while providing service for their profit generation. There are companies that put the lives of their workers at risk but with just low compensation. On the other hand, there are companies that more prioritize health and safety of their workers than with the amount of money they will earn. In all occasions, companies should always take in consideration the safety of their workers. They should have higher standards in the worker safety, especially to very dangerous tasks or kinds of work. Next is the moral dilemmas of globalization in environmental standards. Technological progress triggered exponential growth in human ability to alter the environment. While this has countless benefits, it also raises a number of dilemmas about the use of natural resources in societies with poor environmental regulations. Because of these technological advancements, environment is in danger. Since population keeps on growing, the natural resources are being overused, especially to places with poor environmental regulations. If resources will be overly used, what will happen to the people? How will they live with scarce resources? These are the questions that are needed to be addressed by every community or society and how they will provide the needs of the people without harming the natural resources. Here is an example. Texaco was accused of making irreversible damage to the Ecuadorian forest because of the use of low standards in the 1970s and 1980s. Texaco is an acronym for the Texas Company. Ano nga ba ang ginawa ng Texaco? So, let's have a backstory. In the late 1970s, may isang American oil company na under ng Texaco brand. They had a contract with the Ecuador's government to extract oil from the basin of the Amazon's rainforest. For over 26 years, the oil company had extracted billions of gallons of crude oil that generated huge revenues for the company. Because of this, the company had committed one of the worst acts of environmental abuse in history. Ecuador is a small country but with variety of plants, animals, and indigenous groups. Because of Texaco's substandard practices, people in Ecuador get sick and are dying. Texaco only cares for their profit and not with the expense of the indigenous groups and delicate ecosystems. A similar case was also happened in southern Argentina's shale gas field of Vaca Muerta. Protests have arisen against the activities of oil companies YPF and Chevron for using allegedly low environmental standards in fracking. Dahil sa globalization, businesses more focus on profitability and turn a blind eye to the consequences of their substandard practices. This is now the moral dilemma in the environmental standards. The same incident also happens in the late 1990s where the Finnish company Botnia planned the construction of a pulp mill in the city of Fray Bentos, on the shores of the Uruguay River near the border with Argentina. The project was heavily resisted by environmental advocacy groups. Botnia was accused of making extra profits by following lower environmental standards than in the home country. Another frequent international environmental dilemma is related to toxic waste. It is estimated that a considerable part of China's arable land is polluted with lead, zinc, and other heavy metals exported from developed economies. Arable land means a land that is good for growing crops. Old computers that are discarded in the United States usually end up in China, where the cost of disposal is 90% lower. Some emerging economies have sought to attract foreign direct investment by lowering environmental standards, in a phenomenon known as race to the bottom and the creation of countries that work as pollution havens. Ano nga ba itong race to the bottom and pollution havens? Race to the bottom is a tactic that involves both scaling back policies that are already in place and passing of new policies that encourage less environmentally friendly behavior. Now, we will discuss about the problem of pollution havens. Pollution haven theory posits that foreign investors from industrial countries are attracted to weak environmental regulations in developing countries. This principle says that a company would want to locate in a country with the lowest environmental standards. Sa pollution of havens, tinitake advantage dito ng mga investors or businessmen from industrial countries o mga mayayamang bansa yung lower environmental standards ng mga developing countries o mga bansang papaunlad pa lamang. Ginagawa ito ng mga investors or businessmen para mas magkaroon ng maraming kita habang konti ang kanilang binabayarang expenses o inilalabas na pera. Kapag lower environmental standard po kasi meron ng isang bansa, ibig sabihin hindi sila masyadong strict sa environmental regulations nila. Kaya ito yung nagiging asset ng mga businessman to achieve greater profit. Rich countries usually have strict environmental regulations and poor countries do not. Environmentally hazardous activities may be moved to poor countries. Halimbawa po nito is yung about sa Texaco and Ecuador issue na nabanggit po kanina. Since Texaco knows that Ecuador has poor environmental standards, they locate their business in Ecuador. Kaya lang, ang nangyari, nagkaroon ng irreversible damage sa Texaco sa Ecuador. Nagkaroon ng pang-aabuso yung Texaco sa environmental welfare and standard ng Ecuador to the point na nakaapekto na sa health and safety of the community and other natural resources. In this case, there are questions regarding the problem of pollution havens. First is whether pollution havens are really an important factor. And second is whether pollution havens deserve to be a subject of international negotiation. But because of its effects, we think that in the pollution havens, the higher environmental standards should be imposed, and the government should interfere with the pollution havens. Though it earned interest, but at the same time, serious damage to the environment is costless. The impact of environmental pollution is a long time, and we cannot lose the greater one. This is now the end of my report. The next discussion will be presented by Jan Fajardo. Thank you.
Good day, I am Justin Jan Fajardo, and I will discuss about the moral dilemmas of globalization, including human rights, cultural diversity, and corruption. So, let's discuss first about the human rights. Human rights. Corporations sometimes face dilemmas linked to operations in countries with governments accused of violating human rights. A high-profile case was IBM's scandal of doing business with the Nazis. In the 1930s and 1940s, IBM provided Hollerith punch cards to the Third Reich, which were used in the operational management of extermination camps. IBM has been accused of providing technology to the Third Reich that allowed Nazis to persecute and kill Holocaust victims more efficiently. IBM provided Hollerith punch cards, and punch card can automatically read information which had been punched onto a card. In the 1970s, Polaroid stopped selling equipment to the government in apartheid South Africa when it learned that cameras were used to make IDs for the surveillance of dissidents. In 1970s, at Polaroid's headquarters, there are two African-American workers named Carolyn Hunter and Ken Williams. They discovered that the company had a business in South Africa selling Polaroid products, which was using it to make the ID cards and passbooks used under the apartheid system. The passbook served as internal passports for black people who needed them to enter cities, and those failure to present a passbook to the police could lead to immediate detention. The passbook came to symbolize the institutionalized racism of apartheid's oppression. In 1993, Levi-Strauss and Company canceled contracts in China due to the systematic violation of human rights perpetually by the governments. Levi-Strauss and Company partially retrenched from China because of what it called pervasive human rights violation, in an attempt by the iconic U.S. jeans company to put working conditions before profit. More recently, Google accepted the Chinese government's request to censor keywords like Tiananmen Square and Dalai Lama in its search engine. Microsoft Bing is one of the few foreign search engines that are accessible in China because the company has agreed to censor results for sensitive terms such as the Dalai Lama Tiananmen Square massacre. The Tiananmen Square protest, known as the June 4th incident in China, where students led demonstrations held in Tiananmen Square, Beijing during 1989. In what is known as the Tiananmen Square massacre, the demonstrations was crushed by Chinese military with great loss of life. The CEO, Eric Smith, stated, "I think it is arrogant to enter a country where we are starting our operations and tell the country how to govern itself."
Next is the cultural diversity. Principles of international law hold that corporations ought to respect the customs and culture of the communities where they operate. Traditional values can be lost to the homogenizing trends introduced by globally integrated production processes and product promotion. When globalization occurs, the companies in new countries must respect the culture of the new place. This becomes a problem for the foreigners since they are not familiar with the culture. Adapting or operating differently from the country's culture brings conflict between the two groups. Some amount of change is inevitable, and certain local practices may not deserve protection if they violate important minimum global norms. However, when should a norm be respected because of cultural diversity considerations, and when should it be ignored because it violates a global minimum? A paradigmatic case occurs with gender equality. It is frequent that anti-discrimination standards clash with traditional customs religious practice. Madalas na ang mga pamantayan laban sa diskriminasyon ay sumasalungat sa tradisyonal na kaugalian o gawaing panrelihiyon. Religious discrimination is treating individuals differently because of their religious beliefs and practices, and/or their request for accommodations of their religious beliefs and practices. Western corporations, which typically promote gender equality at home, often find themselves operating in societies intolerant against women. Sabi na most Western societies have achieved gender equality. Women have all the same legal rights as men, and workplace discrimination based on gender is illegal. But despite this, feminists continue to argue that the battle for gender equality is not yet won. In Saudi Arabia, for example, gender separation is almost total, and women are forbidden by law to practice many professions. It obviously tells that women have been particularly marginalized from cultural life. In Saudi Arabia, men hold the most authority and are responsible for the primary income, security, and safety of the family. They are expected to work outside the home, earn money, and to provide for their family. Women have traditionally taken responsibility for the domestic space as the nurturers and bedrocks of the family. While companies usually justify discriminatory practices out of respect for local traditions, these arguments can be problematic, as in Saudi Arabia today. In Saudi Arabia, ang mga kumpanya rito ay mas karaniwang binibigyang katwiran ang mga gawaing may diskriminasyon bilang paggalang sa kanilang mga lokal na tradisyon. And South Africa maintained a system where a broad segment of society was discriminated against in all walks of life and under the authority of men without any fear of being considered responsible for their actions. At pinanatili naman ng South Africa ang kanilang sistema na kung saan ang isang malawak na bahagi ng lipunan ay may diskriminasyon laban sa lahat ng antas ng pamumuhay at sa ilalim ng otoridad ng mga kalalakihan na walang anumang takot na ituring bilang responsable para sa kanilang mga aksyon. The only difference was that the victims in South Africa were black. In Saudi Arabia are women. Women in Saudi Arabia cannot vote, cannot drive, cannot be treated in a hospital or travel without the written permission of a male guardian. They cannot study the same things men do and are barred from certain professions. Women in Saudi Arabia were denied many of the same rights that blacks and coloreds were denied in South Africa. In some cases, softer ways of discrimination exist. While Mexico does not have formal restrictions against women in the labor market, a widespread macho culture often operates as a glass ceiling. Sinasabi rito na ang Mexico ay walang formal na paghihigpit laban sa kababaihan pagdating sa labor market. Ang macho culture ay ang siyang kadalasang kumikilos. The macho culture, it is referred to a social climate. Following the stereotype, in a macho culture, a man earns respect through his ability to lead his family and defend his honor with violence if necessary. Men can excuse themselves by saying, "I am a product of a macho culture, and that's why I hit my wife." Corporations face an unwritten rule that holds that women should not be in charge of a male team. Using the gender equality standard of the home country, not considering gender as relevant for defining team leadership, could be costly for the company, as employees may not perceive a female boss as a legitimate authority. However, respecting local traditions and denying promotion to a talented executive solely because of gender considerations would seem a violation of the principle of equal opportunity. Nahaharap ang mga corporations sa unwritten rule na nagsasabi na hindi dapat babae ang namamahala sa pangkat ng mga kalalakihan. At dahil sa pagsasaalang-alang ng mga kasarian, ay tila ngang naging isang paglabag ito sa prinsipyo ng pantay na pagkakataon. And lastly, corruption. Corruption is a concept that agglomerates practices ranging from multi-million-dollar payments to high government officials to a few dollars bribe and to a low-level bureaucrat. Ito ay ang pinagsama-samang konsepto na kung saan mula sa multi-million-dollar na pagbabayad sa mataas na opisyal ng pamahalaan hanggang sa ilang dolyar na suhol at hanggang sa mababang antas ng bureaucrat. It is estimated that over $1 trillion are paid in bribes annually, which squanders public resources and deprives millions of foods, education, and other government services to which they are entitled. At tinatayang higit sa $1 trillion ang binabayaran ng mga suhol taon-taon na nag-aaksaya ng mga mapagkukunang pampubliko at nagkakait ng milyon-milyong pagkain, edukasyon at iba pang serbisyo ng gobyerno kung saan sila ang may mas karapatan. Bribery in foreign operations was not always considered morally wrong. Some even saw it as a normal operating expense when doing business in emerging economies. Sinasabi rito na ang panunuhol sa mga international na operation ay hindi palaging nakikitang unethical or morally wrong. When doing business in emerging markets, some even considered it as a standard operational expenses. And German corporate law, while severely punishing bribery at home, considered foreign bribes as tax-deductible expenses. Attitudes toward bribery changed in the late 1970s after the U.S. Congress passed the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which outlawed paying bribes abroad for American companies. And while German business law punishes bribery at home, international bribes are deemed tax-deductible expenses. At ang mga saloobin sa panunuhol ay nagbago noong huling bahagi ng 1970s nang inaprubahan ng Kongreso ng US ang Foreign Corrupt Practices Act na nagbabawal sa mga kumpanyang Amerikano na kumuha ng suhol sa ibang bansa. Corruption is a form of dishonesty or a criminal offense which is undertaken by a person or an organization which is entrusted with a position of authority in order to acquire illicit benefits or abuse power for one's personal gain. And this is the end of my discussion. Again, this is Justin Jan Fajardo. Thank you.